"Do whatever you want, cowboy," said the Apache woman who was tied to the rancher's fence. But then the morning sun stretched lazily across the Montana sky, spilling golden light over the wide fields that seemed to go on forever. Thomas, a rugged cowboy with calloused hands and a quiet heart, walked slowly through the tall grass, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and now, after his father passed away, it was entirely his responsibility. Every fence he mended, every horse he tended, and every acre of land he plowed rested squarely on his shoulders. He was used to hard work, but lately the weight of it felt heavier than ever. The wind carried the scent of fresh hay mixed with the faint smell of leather and horses. Thomas inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the sense of loneliness that had been creeping over him. The ranch was quiet, too quiet sometimes. Only the lowing of the cattle and the occasional whinny of a horse broke the silence. Thomas liked quiet, usually, but on days like this it reminded him of how much he missed having someone to share the burden with, someone who could understand the life he led. As he bent down to tighten a knot on the fence post, he heard a sound that made him pause. A knock, soft, deliberate, polite, echoed through the empty yard. Thomas frowned. Visitors were rare in this part of the country. Most people drove straight past the ranch, uninterested in the lonely stretch of land. He wiped his hands on his worn jeans and straightened, glancing toward the front door. When he opened it, he found a woman standing there. She looked calm, confident, and entirely at ease in the wide-open space of the Montana plains. Her hair was dark, braided loosely over her shoulder, and her eyes held a quiet strength. She didn't smile immediately, but there was warmth in her gaze. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution. "I was told you need a helper," she said simply. Her voice was steady, calm, and certain, as if she had been expecting this moment. Her name, Thomas would soon learn, was Grace. There was something about her presence that made it difficult to dismiss her. She didn't ask for money or promise miracles. She simply offered her help. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. He had been alone for so long that the idea of accepting help felt foreign. He studied her carefully. "You just heard I needed help?" he asked, skeptical. "Yes," Grace replied. "I know what it's like to care for the land. I can help with the animals, the fences, the chores, anything you need." Thomas wanted to refuse politely, to tell her that he was fine managing on his own. Pride had kept him going all these months, after all. Yet something about Grace's presence, the certainty in her voice, and the way she stood with quiet confidence, made him hesitate. He realized he had never met anyone like her, someone who could step into his world without fear, someone who didn't seem intimidated by the wide-open land or the hard work it demanded. Finally, he nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. "Well, all right. You can start by feeding the horses," he said, trying to sound casual, though inside he felt a flicker of hope. Grace smiled faintly. Not with arrogance, but with a gentle assurance that made Thomas feel a little lighter. She moved with purpose, as if she had done this all her life. Watching her work was different. She didn't just feed the animals, she observed them, understanding their moods and behaviors with a quiet intuition that surprised him. She mended broken harnesses, refilled water troughs, and even managed to soothe a nervous colt with nothing more than a calm presence. Thomas found himself studying her movements, noting the efficiency, the care, the knowledge in everything she did. As the morning stretched on, Thomas realized he hadn't had a conversation like this in a long time. They spoke little at first, only enough to coordinate tasks, but every word carried meaning. Grace didn't rush, didn't complain, and didn't demand attention. She simply worked beside him, And in that simple act, she was already teaching him something he had almost forgotten: that hard work could feel lighter when shared. By noon, the sun was high, and the ranch had already seen progress that Thomas hadn't thought possible in weeks. The fences were straighter, the animals calmer, and the air seemed less heavy with worry. Thomas, wiping sweat from his brow, felt a strange sense of relief. He had been so used to doing everything alone that he hadn't realized how exhausted he truly was, until now. Grace, standing nearby, caught his gaze and offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership forming between them. As they ate lunch together, sitting on an old wooden bench outside the barn, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in weeks. He shared small stories about his father, about the ranch, about the long days and the lonely nights. Grace listened, truly listened, without judgment or interruption. Occasionally, she would share stories of her own, tales of growing up near rivers and mountains, learning the land from her family, and understanding animals not just as property, but as companions. Thomas felt an unexpected connection forming, one that went beyond work. After lunch, they returned to the chores. Thomas noticed that he was no longer carrying the weight of every task alone. Grace's presence had made him more aware of the land itself, the way the soil shifted underfoot, the gentle sway of the grass, the quiet beauty of the open sky. He began to see things he had taken for granted, small details that spoke of life and growth and resilience. By the time the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the ranch looked different, not just cleaner or better maintained, but alive in a new way. Thomas realized something important. This was the first time in a long time that he felt hope. The hope that perhaps he didn't have to do everything alone, that the land didn't have to feel like a burden, and that there were people who could step into his life without fear or expectation. As Grace prepared to leave for the evening, Thomas stopped her. I wasn't sure about you coming here," he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "But today you made a difference." Grace smiled softly. "I'm glad I could help. Tomorrow we can tackle the fields near the north fence. There's a section that needs attention before the rain comes." Thomas nodded, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "All right, tomorrow then." As she walked away, Thomas watched her figure disappear into the horizon, feeling a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And why did her presence already feel like a turning point in his life? He closed the door slowly, leaning against it, and allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in weeks, he felt a little less alone. The ranch, the work, the wide-open land, it all seemed a little lighter with Grace's arrival. Little did he know, this single knock at the door would set in motion changes he never imagined, changes that would test his pride, his patience, and ultimately, his heart. That evening, as the stars began to twinkle over the Montana sky, Thomas sat on the porch, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the distant lowing of the cattle seemed almost like a lullaby. He thought about the woman who had appeared at his door, about her calm strength and quiet knowledge, and he realized that life on the ranch, which had seemed so heavy and unending, might finally begin to feel like something shared, something meaningful. And with that thought, Thomas allowed himself to hope, not just for tomorrow, but for the days that would follow, for the possibilities that Grace's arrival might bring, and for the unexpected ways life could change with a single knock on the door. The next morning the sun rose slowly over the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields. Thomas woke early as he always did, but there was a difference today. he felt a quiet anticipation, a small spark of curiosity he hadn't experienced in a long time. The thought of Grace waiting to help gave him an unusual sense of comfort, though he would never admit it out loud. He dressed quickly, pulling on his worn jeans and boots, and stepped outside to the crisp morning air. Grace was already there, moving with calm efficiency. She had brought a small bag with her, neatly packed, and she greeted him with a nod rather than words. Thomas noticed, with some surprise, how naturally she seemed to fit into the rhythm of the ranch. There was no rush in her movements, no wasted energy, only purpose and quiet confidence. "Morning," Thomas said, tipping his hat. His voice sounded rough even to his own ears, but it was the only way he knew how to greet someone properly. "Good morning," Grace replied. Her voice carried the same calm strength as yesterday, steady and reassuring. She didn't smile yet, but there was warmth in her eyes that made Thomas feel lighter somehow. They began the day's work immediately. The first task was the horses, as usual. Thomas handed Grace the feed buckets, and she nodded, understanding without needing instructions. She had a way of moving that made even the most nervous horses feel calm. As she approached the smallest colt, which had been particularly fidgety the day before, she spoke softly, her words gentle, almost like a song. The colt stopped struggling and allowed her to pat its head. Thomas watched, astonished. He had worked with horses for decades, yet he had never seen anyone command such respect from them without force or anger.
"Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, genuinely curious. Grace shrugged lightly.
"I grew up near the mountains. My family worked with horses every day. You learn to listen to them more than you speak at first." Thomas nodded slowly, realizing that her knowledge came from experience, not books. There was a quiet skill in her movements, a patience that he had lost over the years, worn away by endless work and isolation. Watching her work, he felt a strange mix of admiration and humility. After the horses were fed and the water troughs were full, they moved to the fences. There was a long stretch near the northern field that had been damaged by a storm the previous week. Thomas had been putting off repairing it, thinking he could handle it alone. But with Grace's help, the work went faster than he expected. She handed him tools without being asked, suggested better ways to secure the posts, and even shared small tips about preserving the wood against weather damage. Thomas tried to keep a neutral expression, but inside he felt a growing respect for her. Here was a woman who didn't complain, didn't demand, and didn't boast. She simply worked, and in doing so, made everything feel lighter. He realized he had been so focused on surviving alone that he had forgotten how teamwork could make even the hardest labor enjoyable. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and sweat ran down Thomas's face. He leaned against a fence post for a moment, catching his breath, and looked at Grace. She was wiping her brow with a cloth, but her movements were calm and steady, as if fatigue didn't touch her the way it touched him. "You make this look easy," he said, trying to sound casual, though there was genuine admiration in his voice. Grace glanced at him, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. "It's not easy," she said softly. "It just doesn't feel as hard when you know what you're doing and why you're doing it." Thomas considered her words, realizing they held more truth than he expected. She had a way of seeing the land, the animals, and the work in a way he hadn't considered for years. It wasn't just about completing tasks. It was about understanding the rhythm of life on the ranch, respecting it and moving with it rather than against it. After a short break, they tackled the smaller chores, mending fences near the barn, checking on the chickens, and collecting eggs. Each task, though simple, seemed to carry a deeper lesson. Grace moved with intention, observing, adjusting, and guiding without ever seeming pushy. Thomas found himself learning, almost without noticing, how to approach the ranch differently, how to care without overworking, how to guide without forcing, and how to notice details that made a difference. By late afternoon, a small storm began rolling in from the west. Dark clouds stretched across the sky, and the wind picked up, rustling the grass and rattling the loose boards on the barn. Thomas felt a surge of concern. He had been alone during storms before, and the work had been exhausting and stressful. But with Grace here, he felt calm. "We need to secure the livestock before it gets worse," Grace said, her voice carrying an authority that Thomas hadn't expected. "The horses, the cattle, we don't want them panicking." Together, they worked quickly. Thomas guided the cattle into the safer pens while Grace calmed the horses and tied them securely. She seemed to know exactly what to do, even as the wind picked up and rain began to fall in soft sheets. Thomas marveled at her composure. He had weathered countless storms alone, but he had never felt such confidence in facing one. Once the animals were safe, they moved inside the barn to dry off. The rain tapped rhythmically against the roof, creating a soothing sound. Thomas handed Grace a towel, and they sat for a moment, catching their breath. "You really know your way around this," he said quietly, almost in awe. Grace looked at him, her eyes calm and steady. "I know enough to help. That's what matters." Her humility surprised him. She didn't boast or claim to know everything. She simply focused on what needed to be done. It was a lesson Thomas had needed for a long time. He realized that pride had kept him from accepting help before, but Grace's quiet competence was different. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't inspiring. As the storm raged outside, Thomas found himself opening up more. He told Grace about his father, about the challenges of running the ranch alone, and about the long hours that often felt endless. Grace listened, nodding occasionally, never interrupting, but offering small words of understanding that made Thomas feel heard. He hadn't spoken so freely in months, and the relief of sharing his burdens was almost overwhelming. By evening, the storm passed, leaving the land refreshed and glistening with rain. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft, golden light over the fields. Thomas and Grace stepped outside to inspect the ranch. Everything had survived the storm, and thanks to their combined effort, nothing was damaged beyond repair. Thomas felt a quiet pride, not just in the work they had done, but in the realization that he hadn't been alone. Grace had shown him that partnership wasn't just about helping with chores. It was about trust, respect, and shared responsibility. As they cleaned up their tools and prepared for dinner, Thomas glanced at Grace and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "I didn't think anyone could make this ranch feel lighter." Grace smiled faintly, a small but genuine gesture. "It's easier when you don't try to do everything alone." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He had spent years thinking he had to manage alone, that asking for help was a weakness. But watching Grace work, seeing her calm confidence and feeling the relief of shared effort had changed something inside him. That night, as they sat by the fire, the ranch quiet except for the crackling flames, Thomas felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. The work was still hard, the ranch still demanded effort, but with Grace by his side it didn't feel impossible. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas looked forward to tomorrow, not just for the chores, but for the continued partnership that had begun with a simple knock on the door. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Grace's presence would challenge his assumptions, test his patience, and ultimately show him that life was richer when shared with someone who truly understood it. And as he drifted to sleep that night, Thomas realized something he hadn't admitted before. He was no longer alone. The morning after the storm, the ranch was alive with a fresh, earthy scent. The rain had washed the dust from the fields, leaving the soil dark and rich. The grass glistened with droplets, and the sun shone softly through the clouds, warming the air just enough to bring comfort without heat. Thomas stepped outside, stretching his arms and feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the previous day's labor. Despite the soreness, there was a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in months, a feeling that the ranch, though challenging, could be managed, maybe even enjoyed, with Grace's help. Grace was already in motion, moving between the animals with quiet confidence. She noticed Thomas watching her and offered a small nod. "Morning," she said, her voice steady and calm as if the world had settled into its right place. Thomas returned the greeting, tipping his hat in the way he always did, though he felt his heart a little lighter than usual. Today their work would focus on the north pasture, where the storm had caused minor flooding and left several areas of the fence damaged. Thomas grabbed the tools, and Grace carried the supplies with ease, walking alongside him with the rhythm of someone completely at home on the land. "This area will need careful attention," Thomas said as they approached the damaged fence. "The soil is soft, and the posts could easily shift." Grace nodded, inspecting the ground and running her hands over the fence posts. "We'll need to reset some of them deeper, and we might want to reinforce with extra wire." "The cattle won't notice the difference, but it will keep them safe."
A practical approach impressed Thomas.
She didn't just suggest solutions. She considered the land, the animals, and the long-term effects. As they worked side by side, he realized that her presence wasn't just helpful. It was teaching him a better way to care for the ranch. By mid-morning, clouds began to gather again, though this time they were darker and more threatening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and grass, and Thomas could feel the cool bite of rain in the air. He glanced at Grace, expecting concern, but found only calm determination. "We need to finish the fence before the next storm hits," she said. "If the cattle get out, it will be much harder to control them." Thomas nodded, and together they worked faster, yet carefully. Each post they reset, each wire they tightened, was done with precision. Grace's knowledge of the land guided their actions, and Thomas found himself listening to her suggestions more than giving orders. It was a new experience, letting someone else take the lead, even in small ways, and trusting that it would work out. By noon, dark clouds rolled over the horizon and the first drops of rain began to fall. Thomas and Grace didn't stop. Instead, they adapted, moving with the weather and finding shelter when necessary, then returning to their tasks as the rain eased. They laughed quietly at small mistakes, like a bucket tipping over or a post leaning at the wrong angle, and the sound of laughter felt foreign but welcome to Thomas. He realized how long it had been since he had shared a day's work with someone else, and genuinely enjoyed it. The storm returned in earnest by early afternoon. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the soil into slippery mud. Thunder rumbled across the plains, and lightning flashed in the distance. Many would have called it a day, seeking shelter and warmth. But Thomas and Grace pressed on. The livestock needed protection, and the fence wasn't yet secure. Thomas felt his muscles ache, his energy wane, and his hands blister. But Grace remained steady, moving through the rain with calm purpose. Watching her, Thomas understood that resilience wasn't about strength alone. It was about patience, focus, and knowing when to act decisively. Her presence reminded him that no challenge was too great when faced together. "Cows are moving toward the low ground," Grace said, pointing to a small herd. "We need to guide them to the higher pasture before the flood reaches them." Thomas grabbed the ropes and began herding the cattle, while Grace guided them with gentle gestures and soft words. The rain drenched them completely, soaking through their clothes and chilling their bones, but they continued. The cattle, sensing their calm confidence, followed without panic. Thomas realized that the storm, which could have been frightening alone, felt manageable with Grace at his side. After what felt like hours, they managed to secure all the livestock in the higher pasture. Both were soaked, muddy, and exhausted, but a sense of accomplishment hung between them. Thomas leaned against a fence post, breathing heavily, and looked at Grace. She smiled, small but genuine, her eyes sparkling even in the gray light. "You're tougher than I thought," Thomas said, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Grace shook her head lightly, water dripping from her hair. "I've had practice," she replied. "The land teaches you. Every storm, every challenge, you learn to adapt." Thomas realized she was right. He had spent years thinking he had to face every problem alone, relying solely on his own experience and pride. Grace had shown him a new way. Through observation, patience, and collaboration, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, mixed with respect, for the woman who had appeared at his door only days ago. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch glistening under the soft light of a fading sun. Mud clung to their boots and clothes, and their hands bore the marks of the day's labor. But there was a quiet satisfaction in the air. Thomas and Grace inspected the fence once more, ensuring every post was secure, every wire tight. The work was done, and the ranch was safe. They returned to the barn, dripping wet but relieved. Thomas handed Grace a towel, and she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You don't have to make me feel like I'm special for getting wet," she said, though there was no teasing in her voice, only warmth. Thomas smiled, feeling the first real lightness he had experienced in months.
You earned it,
he said simply. Dinner that evening was quiet but pleasant. They shared food and stories, and Thomas noticed how easily he could talk with Grace now. There was no pretense, no awkward silence, just two people sharing a day's work and reflecting on it. Grace spoke about the land she grew up on, the lessons she learned from her family, and the ways she had survived challenges long before meeting Thomas. Her stories were vivid and heartfelt, and Thomas listened with rapt attention, realizing how little he had shared his life with anyone in recent years. After dinner, they stepped outside to the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear night sky. The air was cool, fresh from the rain, and the ranch was quiet except for the distant sounds of the animals settling for the night. Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. "You know," Grace said softly, "storms come and go, but how you handle them—"
that stays with you." Thomas considered her words, realizing they applied not just to the weather, but to life itself.
The storms of the past, loss, loneliness, endless work, had shaped him, but they hadn't broken him. And with Grace's guidance, he had learned a new way to face challenges, with patience, trust, and partnership. As they prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on the day. The storm had tested him physically and mentally, yet it had also strengthened his trust in Grace and in the idea that life could be shared. He realized that the ranch, which had once felt like a heavy burden, could now be a place of growth, learning, and even joy, thanks to the unexpected presence of someone willing to step in and help. And as Thomas lay in bed that night, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, he knew that the days ahead would bring more challenges. But he also knew that with Grace by his side, he would no longer face them alone. The storm had passed, but its lesson remained. Together, they were stronger, wiser, and more capable than either could have been alone. The quiet night settled over the ranch, wrapping everything in a peaceful embrace. Thomas drifted into sleep with a sense of hope, feeling the bond forming between him and Grace grow stronger with each passing day. Little did he know, The challenges ahead would test not only their strength and skill, but also their trust, patience, and the deepening friendship that had begun with a simple knock on the door. The next few days at the ranch passed with a steady rhythm. Thomas and Grace had settled into a pattern of work and quiet conversation, and the land seemed calmer under their combined care. Yet, beneath the surface of routine, a deeper change was happening. Thomas noticed it in small ways: the way he laughed more freely, the way his heart felt lighter after long hours of labor, and the way he looked forward to seeing Grace each morning. It was strange, almost unsettling, to realize that he no longer faced the ranch alone. That morning the sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Thomas woke earlier than usual, his mind already alert and focused on the day ahead. He stepped outside and saw Grace already tending to the horses, her movements calm and precise. She noticed him and gave a small nod, the kind of simple gesture that felt like a warm greeting to a friend. "Morning," Thomas said, tipping his hat as he always did. "Morning," Grace replied. Her voice carried the quiet confidence that had become familiar over the past days. There was no need for unnecessary words. Her presence alone had a grounding effect on him. Today's work would focus on repairing the barn roof, which had been damaged slightly during the recent storm. Thomas had been postponing the task, knowing it would be exhausting and dangerous alone. Grace, however, had suggested they tackle it together, and he had agreed. The idea of working so closely on such a challenging task made him nervous, but also oddly excited. They carried the ladders, tools, and wooden planks carefully to the barn. The morning air was crisp, and the scent of wet earth lingered, reminding Thomas of how alive the land felt after the rain. As they began their work, he noticed the careful attention Grace gave to each nail, each plank, and each movement. She didn't rush, but she moved with purpose, and he found himself mirroring her patience and precision. "You have a careful way of working," Thomas said, pausing to adjust a plank. Grace glanced at him, her expression calm. "It's important. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes can be dangerous," she replied simply. He nodded, realizing that her words applied to more than just the work on the barn. Over the past days, he had seen how she approached life, with patience, care, and respect for the land and the animals. She had shown him that strength wasn't only about doing things alone or quickly. It was about understanding, observing, and acting wisely. As they worked, Thomas felt an unfamiliar comfort in her presence. He began sharing small stories from his childhood, memories of his father teaching him how to ride, how to mend fences, and how to care for the animals. Grace listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged him to reflect further. "You were close to him, weren't you?" she asked softly, noticing the way his eyes held a distant sadness. Thomas nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We were. He taught me everything I know. I guess I thought I could do it all alone after he was gone. But I wasn't ready for it." Grace placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder for a brief moment, an act that surprised him with its warmth. "You don't have to face everything alone," she said. "It's okay to accept help." The words sank into him, lingering in his mind long after they returned to their tasks. For years, Thomas had relied solely on himself, believing that asking for help was a weakness. Grace had shown him a different way, not just through her words, but through her actions. She worked alongside him, not to replace him, but to support him, and in doing so, had begun to break down the walls he had built around himself. By midday, the sun was high, and the barn roof was nearly repaired. Thomas felt a growing sense of pride, not just in the work, but in the partnership he and Grace had formed. There was a quiet joy in achieving something together, in knowing that their combined efforts had made a real difference. They paused for lunch under the shade of an old oak tree, sharing bread, cheese, and apples. As they ate, Thomas realized how easy it had become to talk with Grace. There was no pretense, no awkward silence, only a genuine connection that had grown naturally over the past days. He found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years: his dreams for the ranch, his fears about failing, and even his small hopes for the future. Grace listened patiently, her eyes kind and attentive. She shared her own experiences as well, speaking of the lessons she had learned from her family and the land. Thomas realized that her wisdom was not just practical, but deeply rooted in understanding people and nature alike. Every story, every observation, was a gentle reminder that life was richer when shared and respected. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Thomas suggested they take a walk along the edge of the property. The land stretched endlessly, with rolling hills, wildflowers, and tall grasses swaying in the breeze. It was a peaceful moment, one that allowed them to step away from chores and reflect on the days that had passed. "You've changed this place," Thomas said quietly, gesturing to the fields, the barn, and the animals. "I didn't realize how much I needed help until you arrived." "I didn't change it alone. You've done the work too. I just helped you see it differently." Thomas thought about her words, understanding that her presence had brought more than just physical assistance. She had brought perspective, patience, and trust. And in return, he had begun to trust her, not just with tasks, but with his thoughts, feelings, and even his pride. They continued walking in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from genuine connection. Thomas felt a sense of ease he hadn't experienced in years. He realized that life on the ranch, which had once been heavy with solitude and responsibility, now felt lighter, richer, and more meaningful. As evening approached, they returned to the ranch. Thomas began preparing dinner, while Grace organized the tools and tidied the barn. The routine was simple, yet there was a rhythm to it that felt natural and rewarding. They worked together without needing constant conversation, their partnership evident in every gesture and movement. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the ranch quiet except for the soft crackle of flames. Thomas felt a growing sense of admiration and respect for Grace, not just for her skills, but for her character. She had a calm strength, a gentle confidence, and a wisdom that came from experience and observation. Most of all, she had a way of seeing the best in people and situations, even when Thomas had grown accustomed to doubt and skepticism.
"You've taught me a lot," Thomas admitted quietly.
Not just about the ranch, but about life. Grace tilted her head, considering him. "We teach each other, don't we? Every day, every task, every choice. We learn from it." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of her words. He realized that the walls he had built around himself, pride, fear, and the belief that he had to face life alone, were slowly falling away. Grace had shown him that partnership, trust, and understanding were not weaknesses, but strengths. As the night settled over the ranch, Thomas stepped outside to look at the stars. The sky was clear, and the cool breeze carried the scent of earth, grass, and the distant river. He thought about the journey that had begun with a simple knock on the door, about the storm they had faced together, and about the bond that had grown between him and Grace. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for the ranch, but for himself. He realized that the future could be different, brighter and more fulfilling than he had ever imagined. And he knew that Grace's presence was at the heart of that change. Before heading inside, he turned to Grace, who was watching the stars as well. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled, a quiet, genuine smile. "No thanks needed. We're in this together." Thomas felt the weight of her words. Together. For the first time, he understood the power of that word. Together, they could face challenges, storms, and uncertainties. Together, they could build a life that was not just about surviving, but about thriving. And as he finally stepped inside the house, Thomas knew that the days ahead would continue to test them, challenge them, and shape them. But he also knew that with Grace by his side, he would never have to face them alone. The quiet night settled over the ranch, wrapping everything in a peaceful embrace. Thomas drifted to sleep with a sense of calm and gratitude, feeling the deep bond forming between him and Grace grow stronger with every passing day. Little did he know, the next challenges would not only test their strength and skill, but also deepen the trust, respect, and understanding that had begun with a single knock on the door. The following morning, the sun rose slowly over the Montana plains, casting a golden glow over the ranch. Thomas woke with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The past days had been long, full of hard work, challenges, and lessons, but they had also brought him a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing: hope. He dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside, feeling the crisp morning air brush against his face. Grace was already tending to the horses, moving with her usual calm confidence. When she saw Thomas, she offered a small smile, and he felt a warmth spread through him that he couldn't quite explain. Their partnership had grown stronger with each day, and the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't before. It was no longer just land and livestock. It was a place of shared effort, trust, and connection. "Morning," Thomas said, tipping his hat as he approached. "Morning," Grace replied, her voice calm and steady, yet carrying a quiet sense of purpose. Today, their goal was to finish repairing the barn and to organize the storage area for the winter supplies. The storm from a few days ago had left some sections unstable, and the barn roof needed a final inspection to ensure it would withstand future rains. Thomas had been hesitant to tackle it alone, but with Grace by his side, he felt confident that they could complete the work. They carried the tools and materials to the barn together, coordinating silently. The rhythm of their movements was almost instinctive now. Grace handed Thomas nails and planks just as he needed them, and he found himself anticipating her next move. There was a quiet joy in working side by side, a shared understanding that had grown naturally over time. As they climbed the ladders to inspect the roof, Thomas realized how much he had learned from Grace. Her patience, attention to detail, and respect for the land had changed the way he approached work. He was no longer rushing, no longer burdened by the weight of doing everything alone. Instead, he moved deliberately, thoughtfully, and with a renewed sense of purpose. "Everything looks solid," Grace said after examining the last section of the roof. "The storm didn't do as much damage as we feared. A few extra nails here and there, and it should hold for the rest of the season." Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "Thanks to you," he said, unable to hide the gratitude in his voice. Grace shook her head lightly. "We did this together," she replied. "It's not about who did more. It's about working as a team." Her words resonated deeply with Thomas. He had spent so long believing that strength meant doing everything on his own. Grace had shown him that true strength was knowing when to accept help, when to trust someone else, and when to share the load. He realized that the ranch, which had once been a symbol of isolation and struggle, had become a place of partnership, learning, and growth. After finishing the barn, they moved to organize the storage area. Barrels of feed, sacks of grain, and tools were neatly arranged, and Thomas marveled at Grace's efficiency. She had a way of seeing order in chaos, of transforming a cluttered space into something functional and calm. He found himself learning from her once again, understanding that every task, no matter how small, could be done with care and thoughtfulness. By midday, the work was complete. The barn was sturdy, the storage area organized, and the ranch looked better than it had in years. Thomas felt a quiet pride, not just in the physical work, but in the partnership he and Grace had built. They had faced storms, hard labor, and long days, yet they had come through stronger and more connected than before. As they took a break under the shade of a large oak tree, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since Grace first knocked on his door. He remembered the initial skepticism, the hesitation, and the pride that had made it difficult for him to accept help. Now, he couldn't imagine facing the ranch without her by his side. She had brought not only skill and knowledge, but also perspective, patience, and a sense of companionship that had transformed his life. "You've changed a lot in just a few days," Grace said softly, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. Thomas chuckled lightly. "Maybe? Or maybe you just helped me see things differently." Grace smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. Sometimes that's all it takes, seeing things from a new perspective. The afternoon passed in quiet conversation and reflection. Thomas shared more stories about his father, about the challenges of maintaining the ranch, and even about his dreams for the future. Grace listened patiently, offering gentle encouragement and insight when needed. He realized that her presence had given him more than just practical help. It had given him the courage to open up, to trust, and to hope again. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Grace walked along the edge of the property. The land stretched endlessly before them, fields, pastures, and distant hills, bathed in the soft light of evening. It was a peaceful moment, one that allowed them to appreciate not only the work they had completed, but also the bond they had formed.
"You know," Thomas said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel this."
Hopeful again. The ranch feels lighter, the work feels easier, and I feel like I'm not alone anymore. Grace looked at him, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset.
"You're not alone, and you don't have to be."
Not ever. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest, a deep sense of gratitude and trust. He realized that Grace's arrival had been more than a coincidence. It had been a turning point, a moment that changed the way he saw his life, his responsibilities, and himself. He understood that true partnership was not just about sharing work, it was about sharing trust, respect, and care. As evening fell, they returned to the ranch, tending to the animals and preparing for the night.
The chores were completed efficiently, yet there was a sense of calm and satisfaction that had been missing before.
Thomas felt a new appreciation for the rhythm of life on the ranch, the way the land and animals responded to care, and the joy of facing challenges with someone he trusted by his side. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the ranch quiet except for the crackling flames. Thomas felt a sense of peace that had been absent for years. He thought about the journey that had begun with a simple knock on the door, about the storms they had faced together, and about the bond that had grown between him and Grace. It was a bond built on trust, respect, and shared effort, a bond that had transformed his life and the ranch itself. "You've changed this place," Thomas said softly, looking around the barn, the pastures, and the animals. "And you've changed me too." Grace smiled, a small but genuine expression of warmth. "We change each other. That's how life works, through learning, sharing, and caring." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He realized that the ranch, which had once been a symbol of isolation and struggle, had become a place of growth, hope, and partnership. And at the heart of that transformation was Grace, the woman who had stepped onto his doorstep and quietly changed everything. As the night settled over the ranch, Thomas and Grace stood on the porch looking at the stars twinkling above. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of earth, grass, and the distant river. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the work completed, but for the lessons learned, the trust earned, and the bond formed. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. Grace smiled softly. "No thanks needed. We're in this together." Thomas felt the power of her words. Together. It was a word that carried more meaning than he had ever realized. Together, they had faced storms, challenges, and hard work. Together, they had learned patience, trust, and the value of partnership. And together, they would continue to face whatever life brought next, stronger and more connected than ever. As they turned inside for the night, Thomas knew that the ranch would continue to demand effort, that challenges would arise, and that storms would come again. But he also knew that with Grace by his side, he would never face them alone. The ranch was no longer just land and livestock. It was a shared home, a place of growth, and a symbol of resilience and partnership. That night, as Thomas drifted to sleep, he felt a sense of calm and fulfillment. He thought about the journey from the first knock on the door to the work completed today, about the trust built and the friendship formed. Life had changed, not because the challenges disappeared, but because he no longer faced them alone. And as the ranch lay quiet under the moonlight, Thomas understood something he hadn't realized before. Sometimes the smallest acts, a knock on the door, a kind word, a shared task, could change a life completely. Grace had shown him that life was richer when shared, that trust was stronger than pride, and that even the hardest work could be lighter when faced together. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt hope, joy, and gratitude, and he knew that the future, whatever it might bring, would be brighter and more fulfilling with Grace by his side.